If you want to support me on Patreon, click the element on the end screen.
Hey guys, what's up? Tyler here. So, late one night I was up on my laptop working on a video script and I remarked out loud to myself, well, this has certainly been a weird past 6 years. And obviously the joke is that you could take that sentiment and stretch it out and apply it to just about any length of time, period. But the point is that America and the world's problems did not start in 2015 or 2016 or whatever. They started a long time ago. Now recently I saw some people on Twitter commenting about how Ronald Reagan's presidency set the US on a rather destructive path because of the fallout of his right-wing policies. But that made me think, what would the US and the world be like without Reagan if he were never elected? Alternate History Hub, who is honestly one of my favorite YouTubers, did a video on this topic a few years ago. He posited how 1980s culture, and beyond that, domestic and foreign policy would be affected if it were instead George H.W. Bush, who had been elected in 1980. The main gist of the video is that the zeitgeist of hyper-militarism and the accompanying economic boom would be less intense. That is to say, George H.W. Bush would not have changed U.S. culture nearly as much as Ronald Reagan did. But I thought it would be interesting to put my own spin on this scenario. In fact, for several months, I've actually been developing an alternate history scenario with this exact premise in mind. What if Gerald Ford beat Jimmy Carter in 1976 and was succeeded in 1980 by a Democrat? Obviously, that's not as sexy of a video title, but based on my research, I've come to the conclusion that the elections of 1976 and 1980 were among the most important in U.S. history, modern U.S. history at least. This is not new information to many, but again, stick with me here. Having a Democrat in the White House during the 1980s would certainly, in my mind, change quite a bit about the course of U.S. politics. To what extent is obviously debatable, but what's not debatable, in my mind, is that subtracting Reagan from the equation would have profound effects in the long term, if not just in the short term. So without further ado, here's my take on how avoiding a Ronald Reagan presidency would impact the US and the world. Just to back up a bit, let's examine why the '76 election played out as it did. In the 1970s, the American public was especially skeptical of power in Washington in the wake of Watergate. They had just given Democrats a big boost in the 1974 midterms, and they were looking for an outsider candidate who could embody the anti-corruption spirit that had permeated the public consciousness. In our timeline, that was Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter. Now, Carter was not a very left-wing Democrat. He governed as a moderate, but his campaign style was very well suited for the relatively new presidential primary system. And he secured the Democratic nomination with a promise to clean up the mess that Nixon and Ford had left behind. Carter led Ford, who had pardoned Nixon for crimes related to Watergate, by wide margins throughout the summer. But this narrowed up in the fall during the debates. Carter almost lost to Ford in the Electoral College despite winning the popular vote by almost 2%. Sound familiar? Some believe that Ford cost himself the victory by making a blunder in one of the debates where he downplayed the perceived Soviet threat in Eastern Europe. Now, many historians have debated whether this gaffe had any actual impact on his electoral performance, but what's clear is that the election was close and Carter almost lost. Had he lost, the Democrats would have understandably been devastated. They'd have blamed Eugene McCarthy, who ran a liberal independent campaign, and may or may not have flipped a few key swing states. But regardless, it would have been clear that Carter blew a huge lead in what should have been an easy layup election. Now, as we know from our own history, 4 years later, Carter would go on to lose to Reagan in an absolute blowout. The American public was weary from the gasoline crisis, stagflation, and the ongoing crisis in Iran, and they saw Reagan's calm, smooth-talking Hollywood demeanor as worth the risk of giving the Republicans at least 4 years to address these crises. Carter's campaign had floundered, and with that, the Republican Revolution of the 80s began. Ronald Reagan is known today for his hardline anti-Soviet stance, his advocacy of supply-side economics, and his mobilization of the Christian right, aka the moral majority, within Republican politics. He is understandably controversial, and while many on the right would have you believe that he's one of the greatest presidents to ever live, many on the left, including myself, would tell you he's one of the worst, at least in modern history. let's not forget about James Buchanan. But I think that what's not debatable is that he is one of the most consequential presidents in modern U.S. history, at least with the neutral connotation of the word. The effects of his presidency resonate to this day. He shifted the Overton window, or the realm of respectable political debate, significantly to the right. And the modern Republican Party, at least prior to Trump's ascension, has continued to embody supply-side theory, a hard line on foreign policy, and appeals to evangelical Christian voters. But let's say that Jimmy Carter actually did lose in 1976, and Ford was elected in his own right. How would that affect things down the road, all the way to today? Gerald Ford was not a popular incumbent in 1976. Remember, he had pardoned Nixon for crimes related to Watergate, and he had first ascended to the vice presidency by being appointed to replace Spiro Agnew. If he had won the Electoral College in this year, not only would he be an unpopular incumbent who had first ascended to the presidency without being elected, he would also be the first president-elect to lose the popular vote in the 20th century. Ford would be faced with many of the same issues that plagued Carter during his tenure: stagflation, the gasoline crisis, foreign policy issues. For details of this timeline, I have deferred to some history buffs on the site alternatehistory.com, which has threads about this and other topics. In the estimation of some of these theorists, Ford's State Department would provide more support to Reza Shah Pahlavi's regime in Iran, so the Iranian Revolution might be delayed until after the Shah's death, which wouldn't be long. But even if Iran is not on the public's consciousness in alternate 1980, the myriad of domestic crises would still give the Democratic candidate a leg up in the race, partly because Ford, who assumed office in mid-1974, will be constitutionally barred from seeking a second full term. The 1980 Republican primaries would be a race between Ronald Reagan, John B. Anderson, and Bob Dole, who in this scenario would be the incumbent vice president. Reagan would be favored to win, I think, because of his mobilization and appeals to the hard right-wing base, and Dole was seen as part of the establishment. On the Democratic side, though, it's an open race, and the party might see an opportunity to tack back to the left liberal wing after the more conservative Carter had failed to deliver. The Democrats would be mobilized because of disillusionment with Ford and the GOP, as well as the Electoral College overturning their popular vote win 4 years earlier. Who was the best candidate to take the reins and thus take on Reagan? Well, there's no clear consensus. The primaries would have been crowded with candidates like Jerry Brown, Walter Mondale, and lesser-known figures like Edmund Muskie, Reuben Askew, and Scoop Jackson running as well. The favorite of some alternate history theorists is New York Governor Hugh Carey, who, might I add, I initially confused with Drew Carey. Common mistake. In any event, whichever Democrat wins the White House, they wouldn't necessarily govern like a Bernie Sanders type politician presumably would. The 1970s and 1980s were a time when both parties were shifting to the right on economics and embracing policies such as tax cuts and deregulation, and this predated Reagan. Jimmy Carter famously deregulated the airline industry, and JFK had cut taxes for the rich, albeit not anywhere near as much as Reagan did. And all of this was done with the intention of aiding the ailing economy, even if today we view it as perhaps not the best strategy. Just as if Bush had been president, he famously dismissed supply-side economics as voodoo economics. The economic recovery under a Democrat would be slower and less drastic than it was under Reagan. But the recovery would have been more stable, because while there would be some tax cuts and deregulation, a Democratic White House would have been friendlier to labor and would have coupled these neoliberal reforms with pushes for things like higher wages and universal health care, which the Democrats could have achieved if they had sufficient numbers in Congress and controlled the White House. This Democratic president would also appoint cabinet members and directors of agencies whose priorities were more in line with the left, even if it's not on the same level as FDR's New Deal or Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Let's say Hugh Carey is president in this scenario. If his administration handles the recovery well, then he would be the favorite for re-election, as he would be widely popular, although maybe not as widely popular as Reagan. Such an administration would likely take a different approach to handling the Cold War. While there would still be a military buildup in the wake of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, it would not be on the same level as what we saw in our timeline. Denuclearization might also become a higher priority, which would put less pressure on the USSR, meaning it might survive a little bit longer, although I think internal problems would still lead it to collapse in the mid-1990s. This would also have domestic effects. The debt and deficit would probably still increase during this period, but more of this increase would be the result of social programs like universal health care and blue-collar job creation. This would also have a positive impact on things like the AIDS crisis, with a liberal Democratic administration less likely to overlook the issue. And additionally, the war on drugs, which Reagan took to 11, may not be as intense, and more funding would probably go to rehabilitation rather than punishment.
This is crack.
Without Reagan, what would the GOP look like? Would they still advocate for supply-side economics and represent the Christian right? Well, it's hard to say. There's two schools of thought on this issue. On the one hand, some believe that the rise of a Reagan-like figure was inevitable and would simply happen later, while others believe that the GOP's moderate wing could survive and remain dominant. My position is a bit of a mix of the two. While there were certainly macroeconomic shifts that would have led the Republicans to adopt more conservative stances, at the same time, without Reagan, supply-side theory in particular might not gain widespread acceptance, and thus the Overton window would not shift as far right. Okay, it's alternate 1988, and Kerry's vice president, who in my scenario is the pro-life former governor of Florida, Reuben Askew, is running to succeed him. But he has challengers. Now, people who have written about this scenario believe that the '88 primary could be a race between Askew, Jesse Jackson, or somebody like him, as well as Gary Hart. Hart almost beat Walter Mondale in the '84 primary in our timeline, and while Askew would still receive some support from Labor, his more culturally conservative stances could cost him the votes of more progressive and younger voters, which would hand the nomination to Hart. Gary Hart, who was a senator from Colorado, was a member of a group known as the Atari Democrats.
You can't keep me in here, Atari.
These were Democratic politicians who embraced the coming of the high-tech economy and the information age and things like that, and they were less tied to the old industrial manufacturing interests and traditional labor. The Atari Democrats included people like Bill Bradley and, to an extent, Al Gore. Some theorists reckon that a figure like Hart leading the Democratic Party during this period would completely sideline the rise of figures like Bill Clinton, who came from the more conservative southern wing of the party. Clinton's presidency was very much a reaction to the Republican Revolution, as the New Deal coalition had been unable to beat Reagan and Bush. But Bill Clinton's strategy of triangulation, or governing from the center as much as possible, would be less necessary in a version of Washington, D.C. where liberal Democrats had framed the debate on their terms from the start. Now, assuming that Hart wins due to a good economy, and I think that's a pretty safe assumption, how would he deal with the coming changes of the 1990s? Well, his administration would be more focused on infrastructure improvement and high-tech development, and that might help put the U.S. on a better track to remain #1 in a lot of areas where we've fallen behind, like science and healthcare and education. Hart was also a champion of campaign finance reform, which means that legislation passed in the early 1990s to help combat corruption in the federal government could become more successful and help more politicians become responsive to their constituents. One of Hart's big challenges would be in addressing the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Now, in our history, Iraq's main motivation for doing so was its heavy losses in its own war with Iran during the 1980s. Both sides of this war were at one point funded by the United States, the CIA, and the Iran-Contra scandal was connected to this. Now, without Reagan, there would be no Iran-Contra, but the war may still continue until it reaches a stalemate. While there is conflicting historical information about the exact sequence of events that led to Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait, particularly when it comes to mixed signals from Bush's State Department, the truth is that Iraq, at this point, was desperate. They were being starved of the profits from Kuwait's more valuable oil fields, and this would not change regardless of who is president in the United States. Assuming that Iraq does invade Kuwait, however, Hart's response would be no more hawkish than Bush's, but it may not be any less hawkish than Bush's. The Persian Gulf War, fought through a United Nations coalition, succeeded in its goal of pushing back the Iraqi invasion force. Hart or any Democratic administration, in my opinion, may not have seen sanctions as being enough, and they feel that some kind of military intervention was still necessary, even if it was widely unpopular. If this goes well, then Hart's popularity, just like Bush's, would probably skyrocket. But unlike Bush, I think Hart would also be the favorite to be re-elected in 1992. He would be better suited than Bush, I think, to address the recessed economy with some sort of stimulus bill. Bush was infamously disinterested in using government power to curb the effects of the post-Gulf War recession. And if Hart plays his cards right, then I think even if he had to endure a sex scandal or something like that, I think he still would have gotten the Democrats another 4 years, a fourth consecutive term in the White House. Hart's second term would be more difficult, however. By this time, the Republicans might have retaken Congress and would have had more time to consolidate their support at the state level. With the Cold War over, old fissures in the Republican Party would begin to re-emerge. While I think the religious right would have been more fractured at this time without Reagan, with 1/3 potentially supporting the Republicans, 1/3 supporting the Democrats, and 1/3 sitting out politics entirely, the GOP would have to do everything in its power to regain the White House. After 16 years of Democratic rule, the GOP could go in either direction. They could moderate their stances and nominate some kind of Eisenhower-type candidate, or they could double down on their reactionary elements and nominate a culturally and economically conservative Southern governor, somebody like Carroll Campbell Jr. of South Carolina. If there's anything that the GOP is known for in real life, it's doubling down on their reactionary elements. So even if they nominated and elected somebody who wanted to privatize Social Security and Medicare and that kind of stuff, I could see this alternate version of the Democratic Party being better equipped to fight back, since they had ruled the 1980s. And keep in mind, a Democratic 1980s also means a more liberal Supreme Court, which would have effects for generations. Predicting elections beyond this point would be pretty difficult. The economy was even better in 2000 than it was in 1996, but with a conservative Republican instead of a Democrat governing in 2000, who knows if the dot-com bubble might have burst more intensely. By the 21st century, I think that the Democratic Party would have a solid social democratic wing that was committed to honoring the New Deal and expanding the welfare state, and a neoliberal wing that was friendlier to corporate interests. But keep in mind that this neoliberal wing would still favor things like universal health care, just like Canada's Liberal Party or the UK's Labour Party. The GOP would still be the more conservative party in this scenario, as that energy had to go somewhere. But without Reagan, I think they'd be less extreme. There's no Bush dynasty in this scenario, so our chances of going into Iraq are slimmer in the early 2000s, and the war on terror and accompanying violations of civil liberties would take on a different form if they happen at all. How the U.S. responds to the Great Recession would, in large part, determine what it's like today. All in all, though, a country that's more educated, healthier, less corrupt, less reactionary, less imperialist, and more economically stable is one possible U.S. that could emerge from a timeline where Reagan was never president. There would still be issues to address, don't get me wrong. Homelessness, LGBT discrimination, immigration, climate change, the drug war, police reform, a lot of things. But without Reagan, I do think that the U.S. would have less income and wealth inequality, which in and of itself would make the U.S. a better place to live. Thanks for watching this video, guys. I had a lot of fun doing the research for this. If you want to see more content like this, let me know, more alternate history content. This is obviously just one scenario that could emerge from a timeline where Reagan was never president, but this is my take. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and comment, and don't forget to share it. If you want to support me on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/orangeriver. And if you want a hoodie like this, you can go to my Teespring store at teespring.com/stores/orangeriverproductions. And yeah, that's about it. So content like this would not be possible without my patrons. So if you want to support me, links in the description. And I'll see you next time.